Okay, time to get back to NG112 and take it from where we left it. And I hope you had a good coffee break. So we'll continue now with the last session actually of this event, and I will ask my colleagues Freddie and Christina to join me to discuss. So who should do what and when implementing NG112. So I think, Freddie, you'll start the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Benoit, and good afternoon, everybody. So you will have seen there on the first slide, we have a road, and we have a number of years on that road, and we have an NG112 end state. You know, we started to prepare this presentation, you know, quite a while ago, and I never thought about NG112 more than just a project until this event. And you know, listening in particular yesterday to the real life implementation experiences, and today as well from the experiences of Canada, I would now consider it more of a journey than a project. And you know, that's what we try to highlight here on this slide, because you know, your starting point, and it's something that we've been kind of a message we've been reinforcing, and it's been backed up by the speakers at this event, the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration. And so the thing is that, you know, you really do need to get your multi-stakeholder group at the national level set up, you know, and that's not something that requires funding, and it's something that can start now, because we can certainly see from looking at the presentations, you know, the initial discussions on NG112 started years before the official project started. And indeed, if we reflect back on Michael Prosler's presentation on day one, where he talks about the implementation steps, the first milestone is the strategic plan. And you know, you have a lot of work and a lot of talking to do to stakeholders to define requirements. So we really would encourage countries in Europe to, you know, to really start having those discussions right now. Get everybody around the table, all of the stakeholders that are involved in this process, and define requirements. Now, what I will say is that, you know, I say it's a journey, and that journey could be on the highway, or it could be on a mountain road. So it could be fast, or it could be slow, and it could be challenging. But the things that will influence that are what we talk about here, and we'll explore some of these in the following slides. There's the external environment, there's the internal environment that's internal to the emergency services. There is the legislation and standards that exist and that will change and evolve over these years. And then you have the project itself, the strategy, funding, and the implementation. So next slide, please, Benoit. So on the external environment, you know, in my view, the main driver for the need for NG112 has been the smartphone. And when I was researching this slide, I found this very interesting list published by Popular Mechanics, the 101 gadgets that changed the world. And there's some really interesting things in there, and how they really had a positive impact on the lives of society. But top of the list is the smartphone. And okay, the first smartphone came out in 2007, but I think it's fundamentally or profoundly influenced how we interact with each other, how we interact with business and with society, and it will continue to do so in the years ahead. There are now 2.87 billion smartphone users in the world, you know, so almost half of the population, if you think about it, at one each. You know, the uptake of mobile internet use is very high, and 70% of all web traffic happens on a mobile device now, and that's also driven by the smartphone. Another thing here that's interesting is the growth and emergence of M2M, machine to machine, and Internet of Things, IoT communications. McKinsey reckons that by 2030, 70% of all connected devices will be M2M IoT. Now, what does this mean for emergency services? Well, you know, we've already seen, and we are seeing, PSAPs receiving calls from IoT devices, like wearables. Even if you look at, in-vehicle systems and cars calling emergency services. And the problem with that, while there are great benefits, the problem is that these devices are being developed without any consultation with the emergency services. And this is something we'd like to see more collaboration between the IoT community and the emergency services going forward. And NG112 is needed to be able to receive and process those types of communications. Next slide, please, Benoit. So, like everything else, when you have a technology development, you have users that take up that development, and then that drives demand, and you create this virtuous cycle of innovation, really, because the technology is taken up by the users who demand more from the technology, and then you have innovation speeding up on the technology side, and it's just like a circle, really. And when we look at how we communicate today, end users are not just making telephone calls anymore or sending SMS. They're using different types of services, over-the-top communications, social media apps, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, things like that. And certainly younger generations will expect to be able to contact emergency services using those tools, the tools they use to communicate on a daily basis. If we look in today's situation, 70 to 80% of emergency calls in Europe originate on mobile devices. And I think what we'll see over time is that we'll have less calls and more communications. And indeed, even already the legislation in Europe is starting to see that trend and is adapting for that trend to continue. But of course, being able to send voice and video and pictures, different types of media, if you like, while that is a benefit for the user, it also is a benefit for the emergency services. We know that social media intelligence, for example, or drones footage, or that type of contextualized information is really useful to inform decisions at the emergency services, which of course leads to a more effective emergency response. I've already mentioned the IoT, and we are likely to see the number of contacts from IoT devices to emergency services increasing. But as I said, it's important that there's collaboration between the IoT community and emergency services to ensure that those contacts are relevant and can be processed properly at the emergency communications or the emergency services side, because the resource and filtering those calls and dealing with them and trying to figure out what are real emergency calls, that's resources that the emergency services could put to better use. And of course, because of this kind of constant innovation we have, and having that platform that a smartphone provides, we will see smarter solutions emerging for access to emergency services for persons with disabilities. And of course, when you have this kind of innovation on the sending side, the PSAPs need to be able to be ready to respond and be able to receive and process those types of communications as well. Next slide, please, Benoit. And of course, the other thing in the middle of all of this is the networks. And over the last 20 years, the networks in Europe, both fixed and mobile, have evolved beyond recognition almost, particularly mobile. And the need for investment in mobile networks continues. And of course, those investing in the networks need to get a return, and they want to see the resource used properly so that they can monetize their investment. And in particular here, we're talking about radio frequencies, radio spectrum. And the GSMA Mobile Economy Report in 2020 showed that in 2019, the mix of legacy and next generation mobile technology was quite balanced, in the sense that, it was, well, just over half was next generation, and you still had like 42% that was 2G and 3G. However, by 2025, it's expected that legacy technology will reduce to about 8% in the technology mix. So if you extrapolate that out, you could say with a reasonable degree of confidence that by the end of this decade, 2G, 3G will be completely switched off, and we will have 4G and 5G and 6G networks. But of course, trying to determine when 2G and 3G switched off is something that there is no kind of harmonized view on it. It creates some uncertainty. It certainly creates some uncertainty for investing in NG112. That doesn't mean the investment shouldn't happen, but it would be good to have some kind of guidance on when things are going to happen. And at the moment, Benoit, if you go to the next slide, please. At the moment, we have indications from some operators in Europe as to when they plan to sunset 2G and 3G. But as I say, no kind of harmonized view. And of course, it's very challenging to get a harmonized view because, yes, there's demand for new types of services, but there's also a need to provide legacy support. And one of the challenges is how long you provide legacy support. And this is something that will be discussed in the whole debate about eCall in the next few years. Next slide, please, Benoit. So that is the kind of the technology developments, the user preferences, the network evolution, the external environment to emergency services, if you like. But then we need to consider the internal environment as well. Christina, do you want to take it from here?
That's actually my my turn, Freddie.
Oh, sorry, Benoit.
It's okay. So yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation about the external environment. And as you rightly said, now it's also up to the PSAPs to basically to follow that trend and to adapt also to that external environment. And here NG112, as we write, is a mean to ensure that PSAPs are ready to receive and process these new types of information and communication, whatever the origin is on the communication. So first of all, a few observations we've made actually from EENA together with my colleagues, just at observing this changing internal environment. If we look at the PSAPs, so first of all, we noticed that in general, and of course there's some exemptions in a few countries, but in general, what we've tend to see is that PSAPs and emergency services organizations are in general quite slow to adapt to new technologies. So while there might be some reasons, of course, and the priority here is to ensure the continuity of service and that what we have will always be working, which might actually set quite some limits actually on the adoption of new technologies. However, that sometimes results in missing opportunities. So it's not something we want to miss. Freddie was just telling us about like the new world of opportunities that is emerging. So now it's time to make sure that we won't miss those opportunities. When we speak actually about adopting new technologies, we actually notice that sometimes it's a bit hard for PSAPs to actually have like one different implementation for each technology. And with one implementation, there's always like one entry point and so on. And it's also very hard to manage like practically for PSAPs to have to deal with each implementation one at a time. So for each feature, you have one implementation. So hopefully NG112 will also help to have this all these implementation and these new technologies being like brought to basically to the same system together. So that is something that might change for the goods actually. Other observation we have about emergency services today, and here again there are some differences across the countries, but sometimes we notice that there's some lack of connectivity between the emergency services. It can be between emergency services from different regions, but also within the same regions from different agencies or organizations. Sometimes within one region, like the police work really like on themselves, and the emergency medical services as well, and the fire and rescue services as well. The only way they have to communicate is by voice, while there's actually a lot of like operations that require some good cooperation and also some exchange of data. And sometimes it's just not technically possible to exchange this data. And this must change also. We are in 2021, so we should have a way to better connect the emergency services. And here, as we write, we don't mean like to share everything, because of course each organization will have to handle some data and will not be able to share everything for like legal reasons sometimes. And also they don't have to like totally change the way they operate. They're like each agency can still work separately, but there should just be a way to better exchange some information between them. I guess we can all agree on that. And as we speak about like connection between the emergency services, we can actually speak about like the connection between different regions, which can help when there's like, let's imagine there's a natural disaster happening in one region. So first of all, because of that disaster, the PSAP might not be reachable because it has been affected by the disaster. So like there can be like floods or like a fire on the PSAP and like it needs to be evacuated. But that can also result in a congestion of the volume of emergency calls, because there's a sudden unexpected peak of emergency communications, and it's not always easy. Well, it's not like the PSAPs cannot anticipate it. So for small PSAPs, that can result in a congestion of PSAPs. So in that case, there should be some possibility of backup or like redundancy. So we can imagine that another region would be able to take over the traffic of emergency communications while the main PSAP is not available or not reachable. So this is something that NG112 can also address as this issue, because it will actually better connect the emergency services. And if we speak about that, actually, we can observe now that there's actually some, let's say, restricted or like rigid routing decision of emergency communications. Typically, when you call an emergency number, you are in a certain region, your communication will be handled in the PSAP serving for that region, let's say. So that sounds very simple, but with new technologies, it will be possible to change the routing decision depending on different parameters. Of course, the location of the person will be one of the main parameters, but you can also imagine that, you know, if you receive a call from a person with disabilities, like with hearing disabilities, for instance, or if you receive a call from a tourist, for instance, or if you receive a call from a person who speaks a specific language, you can also add that to the routing decisions to make sure that basically the best call taker will be able to handle the communication. Actually, the most appropriate call taker can handle the communication. Another observation we've made is that today we're in 2021 and access to emergency services is still not fully equivalent to all end users, and especially for people with disabilities in many countries, the way to contact the emergency services is still not satisfactory at all, and this is just not acceptable. We are in 2021, so we should offer the best service possible using all the technologies that are available to basically provide the same quality of service to everyone. And well, there is some legislation that is coming that will help that, but NG112 is also a way to address this issue of offering like really equivalent access to everyone. Something that is very interesting that actually is not really appeared, but like was highlighted during the recent or the current sanitary crisis is the ability to do home working. So I guess most of us in this webinar are working from home. There is still a difficulty in many PSAPs and many countries to allow remote call taking. So one can imagine that you know, when you have a crisis like we are living actually, and the authorities are encouraging everyone, all the staff, to work from home, all the labor force in the country to work from home, there should be a possibility for call takers also to handle emergency communications remotely. And I know there's a lot of like technical issues around that we need to solve, and not only technical actually, but also operational. But that is also something that can be addressed by NG112, is allowing basically the staff to handle remotely some emergency communication. So this must be something also that we have to keep in mind, because it's an issue that will come again and again, and it's an issue that gets a lot more attention at the moment. And finally, one last observation is that sometimes PSAPs are usually able now to receive and to handle just like voice or written communications, but sometimes it can be helpful to get some additional information, and this information can be easily provided by pictures or by video. And it's actually quite striking to think that, you know, if you call a friend and you have something to explain, and sometimes you just say like during the call, you just say like, hold on, I'll send you a video or an image and you'll see better. So this is possible between us and our friends, but this is usually not possible between us and the emergency services. So this is something that I guess will be coming. There will be a growing demand from both the emergency services, but also from the general population in general. So this must be something that we should look at, and also NG112 will help addressing this issue. So so yeah, these are a few observations on how you know what issues are rising at the moment in the topic of in the sector of emergency services, and NG112 can actually address these issues. So it's interesting to have a look at that. There's one slide about legislation. Those of you who know me know that I can speak about it for like 5 hours, but I'll try to make it in a very short amount of time. You're probably familiar already with the European Electronic Communications Code, which was adopted in 2018. And it basically, it's the main legislation in the European Union about emergency communications. And it actually introduced the concept of emergency communications instead of emergency calls in order to adapt to the new reality of electronic communications, actually. So now we must say emergency communication. And this text basically brought a lot of improvement, including better location information for emergency communications, but also better means to access the emergency services, especially for people with disabilities, and public warning systems also that will be coming. And the deadline to transpose, so transposition means the adaptation of this European legislation into the national law of the member states. The deadline was in December last year for most of the provisions. So now this must be enforced already in most of the member states. But this will be completed actually in 2022 by a delegated regulation. So delegated, or delegated act actually. So this piece of legislation just aims at completing and like supplementing what was already in the EECC, but just like addressing more specifically a few topics. And these topics are color location, access for people with disabilities, and routing to the most appropriate PSAP. So we can expect some clear rules to come in 2022, so in December 2022. So the European Commission is currently working on that. So that is something that we will have to follow. And 2022 will actually be a very important year because it's also the deadline for the implementation, the transposition of the European Accessibility Act. That's a legislation that was voted in 2019 about to just improve the accessibility to different types of products and services in the European Union. But some part of it is about access to emergency services, and it basically provides for more concrete and better ways of access to 112 for people with disabilities. More concretely by mandating the implementation of real-time text technology, where in the countries that have voice calls to the emergency services, so it means everywhere, but also in some cases of total conversation services. So that legislation was welcome in 2019. The deadline for transposition is 2022, and the measures that will be implemented in the member states must be in application by June 2025. So there's still some time, but it should be part of a global strategy on how we deal with emergency communications in 2025. And finally, in 2022, next year, so as I said, it's a very big year that is coming. We'll also have some reflection about eCall, and with some amendments to the eCall delegated regulations to basically introduce next generation eCall. So that will also be coming. So as you see, there's still many things happening in the next months or next years and hopefully now we will have actually a full legal background that will really enable the implementation of next generation 112. So these are basically what I have been saying. Actually, the Electronic Communications Code and the European Accessibility Act will be a key enabler for NG112, as NG112 is a way to really be compliant with these legislations. Plus, to be followed, of course, some new legislative instruments that will be coming starting from next year, and that will impose new obligations and further guidance. And here again, NG112 provides the necessary elements to meet the obligations that are in the legislation. And of course, also the legislation should support the implementation of the technical standards and specifications. That is something that is also very important, and we have been mentioning that in the earlier presentations since the beginning of the week. So who should do what and when to implement NG112? We have tried to define a few, like a key instructions for each stakeholder on like how to basically contribute to the implementation of NG112. As we've seen together actually throughout all these 3 days, is that everyone should contribute to it, and we all have a role to play in that. So we have tried to define these roles, but of course everything will come with a few clearer instructions, and each country actually will have their local adaptation of that. But so we've tried to put some requirements for each stakeholder. The first one is EC stands for the European Commission, and the role of the European Commission is actually to adopt the delegated acts that I just mentioned by the end of 2022. So the delegated act on the European Electronic Communications Code, plus also on eCall. So that will be important and to be followed. And it's actually in the context of these the adoption of such acts that the European Commission already has running an experts group on emergency communication, which is called EG112, and is there's representatives from each country to basically reflect on what should be in these acts. And we believe that NG112 should clearly be put on the agenda of the meetings of EG112s. When we look at national authorities, of course, the role is very important. First, to transpose and to implement the European legislation, so the EECC and the EAA. So for EECC, the deadline was December 2020, but still many countries are not compliant with it. So it's very important to have this transposition done without delay, so that we can really move forward and really start the technical implementation. But also, actually, it's not necessary just to wait for the adoption of this legislation, because we can prepare for the introduction also of new legislation that will be coming. As I said, we can predict also some changes in 2022, so we can already anticipate that. And it's important to basically start discussions with all the stakeholders, so PSAPs, network operators, telecom regulators, etc., as early as possible to define NG112 requirements, because what we've heard in the past presentations, especially yesterday and today, is that these discussions take time, and then you'll need to test and to refine all these requirements. So these are not something that you can do in just 1 week. So it's important to start these discussions as early as possible, and then to progress regularly also, depending on the new things that appear. BEREC have a role. So for the non-European ones here, BEREC is the Bureau of European Regulators for Electronic Communications. It's basically, we can describe that as like an umbrella organization that gathers the national regulators in telecommunications from each of the member states of the European Union. And by law, by the European Electronic Communications Code, BEREC has to monitor the use of what we call number-independent electronic communications services. So it's basically also called the over-the-top platforms, or like communication platform that are not based on a number. So like the social media apps, for instance, and there's many examples of number independent platforms. And basically, BEREC has to monitor the increased use of such apps and assess whether it appreciably threatens access to emergency services. So this is something that BEREC does regularly, and it's important to do so and to produce some opinions about how we should approach that issue. And finally, some requirements also on the PSAP is be ready to respond to external changes and be aware of the consequences that they may have. I think it's very important to follow all of that, and we try at EENA also to alert on everything that is changing. Plus also to contact the national authorities and all the PSAPs and telecom operators to ask for the national authorities to start the discussions as early as possible, and to provide all the requirements that you will have in the operations of the PSAP, because it's important also to define that in advance. Some requirements also for the PSAP equipment vendors is to ensure basically that all the offerings are compliant with the NG112 standards. There's a certain number of plug tests that are organized also by ETSI, the European Telecommunication Standards Institute, together with EENA. So it's important to make sure that and to verify actually that the products comply with the standards. We have some requirements for both the fixed and the mobile network operators, which is to work with the PSAP and the handset manufacturers to introduce SIP-based emergency calling, and that's something that must be done also with the handset manufacturers, and to start basically doing it now, and I think this has already started. And actually, as we speak about SIP, to collaborate to resolve any issues on the implementation of IP-based calling for all the emergency calls or communication, and one more requirement, which is to use circuit switched fallback on mobile network operators only as a last resort, and then gradually phase out when it's actually no longer necessary. That will be coming in the next years also. And in general, we have, like, it's a requirement for everyone, for all stakeholders, is to plan and implement the SINETs and NG112 components early, and actually, as I said, to start the discussions as early as possible. I'm repeating myself, but I think I believe it's very important to do it. So we have now a time for where you have to work actually, and to explain to us actually what you feel about all of this. So if you were with us the first day, we have another survey using the same platform. You must already be familiar with it now. So I invite you to take either your computer or your smartphone or your tablet and go to the website www.menti.com and use the code that appears on the screen, 78 64 55 22, to connect to it. And you can already start responding to the first question. I'll let you a few minutes to connect to it. Actually, 32 people have started answering, and we see that we have a majority of PSAPs and public authorities today. I will still let you a bit of time. It's the afternoon, so you might not be as productive as you were before. Perhaps need a bit of time. And I will myself connect as well. All right, still a few seconds to join. I see we're now 74, and still a majority of PSAPs, also some vendors present. 78. 80. All right, then I think we can move to the first question of the day, and hopefully others can also follow and join a bit later for the sessions. And actually, we'd like to hear your view on what are the biggest barriers to NG112 implementation in Europe. So we've been going through many different issues during the presentations, those 3 days, and we'll ask you to rank. You can like select as many barriers as you want, and rank them in the right order. And what do you think is the biggest barrier? So I see that 3 people have each said something, but you can add like more than one option, and you can actually rank them. So what do you think will affect the most NG112 implementation in Europe? Is it legislative gaps or standardization gaps? And I see that it is currently the majority. Do you think that there's a lack of certainty regarding a time frame for 2G, 3G switch off, and so that lack of certainty will be a barrier for the implementation of NG112? Do you think that there will be a lack of support from some stakeholders like public authorities, MNOs, etc.? Do you think that implementation of NG112 might be affected by the fact that there's like different organizations for emergency services in different countries, so that will be hard to follow the standards, for instance? Do you think that there's just a lack of understanding of NG112, or do you think that funding will be an issue? I'll leave you a few seconds more to vote. All right, I see that 85 people have responded to it. So there's a majority of people who think that, well, in general, what is considered to be the biggest barrier is some gaps in the legislation and standardization. Since this is quite vague, what I would invite you to is to share in the chat box, to share some comments on why do you think there is or there will be some legislative and standardization gaps, and then we can also discuss how these can be addressed. I see also that many of you fear that there would be a lack of support from some stakeholders, and that would hamper the implementation of NG112 in Europe. Plus, also you rank quite high the fact that there's some lack of understanding of NG112 in Europe, and that can have some problematics on the implementation of NG112. Freddie, Christina, do you want to share a few comments perhaps on those results?
Well, yes. I have to say I'm somewhat surprised to see legislation and standardization up there as the #1 barrier. I thought it would be funding, so at least money's not an issue. It's not as big an issue. I think one of the, just on the funding issue, actually, one of the big observations, we had speakers from the US and Canada, and we know that there's a surcharge on telephone bills in the US, so there's some money ring-fenced there to support investment in PSAPs. We don't have that in Europe, and our PSAPs our emergency services, the entire scope of emergency services rely on public funding. So I'm happy to see that funding isn't the main issue. On the legislation, I think the code provides as you said, Benoit, it's like the basis for legislation in emergency communications, and we know that there will be some obligations and guidance coming in the delegated acts in 2022. So perhaps that could be the gaps that people are talking about, because it should be a little bit more specific. Also the, well, 2G, 3G switch off as the last one. I thought that would be higher up the list as well. But yeah, it's interesting though to do this poll and see the different perspectives and barriers.
Yeah, and let's make this poll again in 2 years, and also we'll see what how it has evolved as well. I think it will be interesting to follow. And yeah, as I said, also like the European Commission is working on these delegated acts for 2022. So if you believe that there are some gaps that are well, basically something that are missing in the legislation, I think it's important to raise the voice these days, actually, so as the European Commission can really anticipate these problems and address that next year, because it's a big opportunity to basically foster the implementation of NG112. So it will be important for you to get in touch with the European Commission or with us to share some comments on how the European legislation or standards actually can better address or encourage the development of NG112.
I think here the first two ones is like the fault of the others. So there are gaps in the legislation and the standardization. There's a lack of support from others. So I think it's also important to know that all of you can do something, and you don't have to wait until the others do something on legislation, or do you need the support of everybody? So somehow I wanted to add this point, and I'm also happy to see funding on the fourth place, because I would think that it was a real barrier.
Yeah, and if you think it has been an issue also across the pond, so yeah, I would have expected to see funding a bit higher, but that's a good news indeed that it's not.
Well, perhaps the lack, I don't know, perhaps we are still not thinking about funding yet.
Yeah, but yeah, let's do again this poll in some time, and we'll see actually whether it has changed or not.
We can keep it in mind for the conference, maybe.
Yeah, indeed. We'll note that down. So we are approaching the end of our event, and I hope that in general we have advanced together on NG112 deployment. So Christina, in general, what do you take from it? What have we learned?
What have we learned? I hope nobody will say nothing. So I think we have learned a lot of things. So we can move to the next slide. So I think the first idea to take from these 3 afternoons is that there's a need of having a working group of a lot of stakeholders that should be involved. So this is let's say a common project with different stakeholders. There's no one single organization that can be alone, can do it alone. It can they will need the involvement of all the chain to establish the requirements. So this national level working group needs to know what are the requirements for this specific country, because NG112 is a general framework, but it can be adapted to each model. So it doesn't mean that all the countries will have to organize their emergency services the same way, or that they have to make a huge reorganization of their emergency services. If the countries are happy with their current organization, they can just organize the same way the next generation emergency communications network, but with another technology. So for this, after establishing the requirements, I think it's very important to have a strategic plan for the implementation, to establish a timeline. So it's not 1 month or 2 that this will happen. It takes years. So we have seen it from some examples, but we really have to focus on the goal. It's not like a super easy project, but it's very, I mean, it can have a lot of benefits for citizens and for emergency services. Also, then if we speak about money, of course, the funding is important to know how to fund this migration to next generation 112 and how to do the procurements. So each country, may be different and have different timelines to do the procurements. And it's also true that it's a very big project that you need to have different vendors and different aspects, so for example, security or others. Each stakeholder will have a responsibility. This also needs to be clear, but everything has to be really synchronized and put together. And for me, the most important thing is that this working group may also evolve during the project, because perhaps at the beginning, you didn't see that it was needed to involve, I don't know, a certain type of telecommunication operators, but at the end, it's also needed. Or it can be evolving also during the project that some parts are already done, and it can and the new people can come. So this is the first thing. Well, we thought that funding was a big problem, but well, my feeling is that we are not still there to speak about funding. We have seen our colleagues from the US and Canada that they have specific funding models by surcharging users, but this is not available in Europe right now. And each country may find different ways of funding this migration to next generation 112. For example, there are some countries that they could somehow avail from EU structural investment and funds. We have seen the example of Romania, and it may also be a good way to fund this project for some countries. Also, we know that there are different stakeholders involved in this big project. So why don't share the fundings between the different stakeholders? We know that in some countries there are agreements between telecommunication operators, national authorities, regional authorities, etc. So this could be also a way to find how to share and how to organize the funding for the migration to next generation 112. And on the European level, it's also another stakeholder. So why couldn't we try to find the way that the European level also somehow funds some common infrastructure that may be needed? I think we can move to the next slide, so we have mentioned this working group with multiple stakeholders, the funding, and let's go to the more practical and technical part is how to build an SINet. That this would be one of the first questions on the technical part. So we have seen that there are different models on how to deploy it. It can be a contract with a commercial entity. Each possibility has pros and cons, risks and benefits, and also some more cost. Always, it can be higher or not, but we can summarize it in three possibilities. To do a contract with a commercial entity, for example, a telecommunication network operator, so that everything is outsourced, that the bandwidth can be scalable. So, for example, if you go to a scheme with migration, step-by-step migration, so at the beginning the capacity could be lower and then increase it. They have a lot of experience in service, giving the service. You can have a good contract with service level agreements, and also you can have flexibility and control of the routing rules, but they will be also responsible for this. So as usual, when you subcontract things, there are some pros that they are really experienced in this specific specific technology, and they can help you a lot on this. There's also the possibility of building your own SINet, so that you have 100% of control of everything, the hardware, the software, and the routing. You will be able to resolve your own problems, so that you don't have to wait until the third-party service listens to you and solve the problem. Even if you have a very good service level agreement, you will not have to wait too much. And if you have several regions that can somehow share the costs, it can be also a benefit. And the solution in the middle is the hybrid approach, so that you have one part that it's contracted to a commercial entity, and other parts that are made by your own. So depends on the situation of the country, also on the fundings, of the needs. It will be different for each organization. We can go to the next slide. And then how to deploy the core services. Here, I think we need to look at it from a step-by-step approach. So there are many countries that are developing now, for example, an app that they start already designing this app using the NG112 standards. It's perhaps a small step at the beginning, but it's already a first step, so that they already built every new project on next generation 112. So you will another message that is really important, and I already mentioned it, is that the next generation 112 can be adapted to each model of the emergency services organizations in the country. So it doesn't mean that you have to change everything. So it may also be a good opportunity to have a more efficient emergency communication handling system, but it doesn't mean that you have to change it. So as conclusion, I think that from now on, the NG112 has to be always in the mind of the people developing new services around emergency communications, and try not to start doing or using other technology if you are developing new things now. And I think we can go to the next one. And we have learned that there's a lot more education is needed because well, we have seen it also in today's Multimeter session, that the lack of knowledge about next generation 112 is one of the biggest problems. And this is why at EENA we have thought about how to solve it, or help to solve it. Freddie, I think you are muted.
Sorry, thanks, Christina. Yes, you know, I think we predicted that lack of knowledge would be a barrier. So, no, in all seriousness, we in our engagements with, you know, people in the emergency services in the different countries in Europe, we did think that there was a lack of understanding, or at least, and it was backed up by our Multimeter survey on day one, where, and today when we looked at the barriers to NG112 implementation, on day one we saw that a lot of people had a basic understanding or no understanding. So, and we hope that this event, of course, would improve that, but we'll see in a while. But as a barrier, we don't want lack of understanding to be a barrier to NG112 implementation. So what we would like to do is set up an EENA NG112 education program, the University of EENA. The objective, of course, would be to inform and discuss with all stakeholders at the national level on implementing NG112. So we would be a traveling university if that allowed. We would be happy to go and have face-to-face meetings with, you know, at the national level with the different countries in Europe, to discuss requirements, you know, to try and understand the needs, perhaps even to give guidance on the implementation based on the organization of emergency services in your country. So again, this is something, it's an idea we have, it's in the early stages, but certainly if you would like more information on it, or you would like to, you know, even at this stage organize something, we would be happy to come to your country and discuss it with the stakeholders. And you can express your interest to me, and my email address is there, fmb@eena.org, and I'd be very happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Freddie. And we have actually prepared the question in the Multimeter. So the only thing you have to do is just to take your phone or your computer again. If you haven't closed the page, you can directly respond to it. Actually, we just want to know whether you would welcome this this initiative, whether you find it as a good initiative. So here the answer is much simpler. It's just yes or no. If you had closed the page earlier, you can just reconnect by going to menti.com and use the code 78645522. And I see that we are running a bit late, but it shouldn't be very long. So just have a few questions and then we'll be able to wrap up.
Only 3 no's, so that's a good sign.
And those 3 no's, if they change their mind, they know where we are.
So Freddie, your mailbox will explode in the next days.
Yes, it looks like it. But this is good. We welcome it.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, I see that majority of you would welcome this initiative, so we're happy to help. So feel free to reach out to us should you want to organize that, and hopefully it can lead to starting things in the country. So we'll be in touch then. Then we have one, I think it's the last question, if I manage to switch to it, is actually, as we speak about our education program, and of course we'll have more events, and we'll have hopefully the EENA conference organized soon. We'd like to know what aspects of NG112 you'd be more interested in hearing. Is there some specific point that we should in particular look at in the education program and the upcoming events? So here it's just a word cloud, so you can just type some words, and then it will appear on the screen. And there's a filter for swear words, so you cannot insult us actually. And if you look at the word cloud, actually the words that you see in the bigger the word is, it means that it has been mentioned several times. So we can see that, for instance, standards and eCall and ESINet has been mentioned many times. I see that we have a lot of propositions, which is great. So we'll obviously note that down and try to take that into account when we build the program for the next events and the conference, for instance. And I can see a majority of standards and architecture, ESINet, AML, eCall, SIP, conformance testing. Okay, I think we are good. So thanks a lot for your propositions. And yeah, we'll keep that in mind. Still receiving a few. Yeah, we'll close at 63, and we'll move for the last question of the day, which is actually a question that we asked already. When was it? 2 days ago, on Tuesday, and we wanted to know whether after this event your perception of it has changed. Perhaps it hasn't. And yeah, as I said, we are running a bit late, but so after that last question, we will actually just conclude the event, and then we can actually, if you can afford staying a few minutes more, we can go through some questions and comments that were raised. Okay, and I see that a considerable majority of you think that NG112 should be deployed in 3 to 5 years, and many of you say that it should also the deployment should start right now, and we can actually compare that to what events of April. Here it is. There has been some kind of shift from right now to in 3 to 5 years. But I hope the reflection will start as early as possible. All right, time to conclude. Freddie, perhaps you can share with us some key messages we've heard from each of the speakers of this event since Tuesday.
Yes. So what we did here was we just tried to take a message or a theme from each of the presentations that we had over the 3 days. So on the first day, our first speaker was Luca Bergonzi, and his message was not to get caught unexpectedly by changing technology and user preference. Act now for a smooth transition to NG112. And I think the message there is not to be reacting, let's say, for example, to waiting for legislation to say you need to implement this. Start the discussions now. I think even reflecting back on the previous slide, that people realize we asked about deployment. I think people realize that there's a lot of discussion, that has to happen before you even start deploying. So the message is to act now and get in contact with your stakeholders. And then on the second bullet, our second speaker was Wolfgang Kampler, and Wolfgang's, this isn't a quote from him, but I think it was the overall theme of his presentation. NG112 standards have been developed, and over the last number of years in projects, plug tests, conformance tests, the concepts in those standards have been proven. So standardization should not be a barrier, even though a lot of you think there are gaps there. But it really does demonstrate, based on the Wolfgang's presentation, that there is no major issue with standards that would stop you moving forward with NG112. And then we had very interesting presentation from Michael Prosler, and this idea of the inside-out approach to deployment and the 7 implementation milestones. And I'm talking, Sean, please. No, yes. And excuse me for that. Right on time. So yes, so Michael's presentation was about the strategy being at the core of the project. And once you have your infrastructure deployed, then you can start to enable your PSAPs or enable different services, like if you need to, let's say, an app for emergency access, that these things can be turned on in a kind of a phased way in the future. And then the next two from Romania and France, I think they kind of go together. So we talk about the operational requirements of the emergency services, so it's not just focused on the benefits for citizens, which is important, of course, but when you are looking at the scope of the project, to take everything into account, even the opportunity cost of not going to NG112. We heard from some of our speakers about maintaining legacy equipment, about trying to source parts on eBay or source expertise to maintain the equipment. And you need to take all of these the operational issues, as well as what the capital cost would be. As Michelle said, the emergency services will benefit from the technologies, of course, but also decrease their expenses. And of course, reduced operational expenditure will help with the business case for getting the funding for the capital expenditure. Soren had a very good point about investing in employees. It's not all about technology. In the emergency services, there are dedicated and hardworking people. And when you deploy new solutions and you train people, and they have then the knowledge and the know-how to actually make much better decisions, and because they have all of the information right there in front of them to do it, it makes their job easier, probably makes it more interesting. And this issue of having high churn rates or high attrition rates of employees in PSAPs is something that this could help to alleviate. And then Budge again, and indeed Etienne as well in his presentation today, they talked about collaboration, and collaboration being very, very important. And this is something that starts at the very, very outset in the initial discussions on moving to NG112. And then finally, Bill Ewell, I think he had the message of the day yesterday. NG112 is a challenging project. As I said, I wouldn't even call it a project anymore. I'd call it a journey. There would be bumps along the road, but the important thing is to keep focused on the goal. So eyes on the prize.
And the conclusions, I think we have all of them, or we have covered all of them, but just to summarize, that next generation 112 is not futuristic, so you can already start now to deploy it. As we have seen, many countries have already started, or at least to start thinking about it and creating this multi-stakeholder working group. So this will, of course, foster ideas, and you will be able to plan and see what are the next steps to be done. Think about next generation 112 by design. If you are planning to do new projects, already use the standards on and the components of the next generation 112 architecture. This will make your life easier afterwards. And we see really that next generation 112 the architecture will be an enabler for new technologies, that emergency services will be faster to implement and welcome new innovations and technology. And it will solve some issues that we have today, like the equivalent access for all the citizens, roaming issues, data, communication, etc. And well, the first step and the biggest component of the NG112 architecture is the SINet. So this would be perhaps the first strategical approach that you will need to think about. But well, as said, the first step is really to create this multi-stakeholders working group. And if you need some help, we are here to listen to your questions and answer and help in everything that we can.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Freddie, for this presentation. So that marks the end of our presentation. Just wanted to highlight that so this has been an event on NG112, and we sincerely hope that you have a better understanding now on the issues that are at stake, and also what NG112 is and how to implement it with what actors and what each of us has to do in that. We'll surely be in touch on how to progress on that. This is the very beginning of a journey, not a project, and we'll follow up on that on many different occasions, many different webinars, and of course the EENA conference, and hopefully we'll be able to meet physically. So you can, if you haven't done it, you can mark the date in your agenda. It's from the 6th to the 8th of October in 2021 in Riga, that's in Latvia. That's the nice city that you can see on this picture. And the registrations will be opening soon, and we have a call for abstract that is ongoing. So if you feel like you have something interesting to say, and I'm sure you have, you can just propose it. You can click on the link that is mentioned in the slide here, or just go to www.eenaconference.org, and you'll find all the information that you need about the conference and the call for abstract. You can also reach out to us, Christina, Freddie, and myself. You can see on the screen our mail address or Twitter handle. So yeah, thanks a lot to everyone. And actually, I'd like so now this presentation is done, but I see that during this presentation, many questions have been asked. So I'd like perhaps that we take a few minutes to discuss them. I'm sorry for if we're a bit late, but perhaps Christina and Freddie, we can stay on the line for 5 to 10 minutes so that we can make sure to respond to everybody. So I will just first read the first question, if I manage. Not yet. Yeah, so we had one question from Michel Vettevald, which is on user preferences using the OTT applications. Do you think that the capability to speak the caller's language, e.g. with automatic translation, could be added?
So here in the emergency services, automatic translation it's always a risk. So right now there's a good translators, but you are not 100% sure that the translation will be made correctly. So of course this is an issue for emergency services when they are contacted by a caller who doesn't speak the language of the country or another language that is spoken by call takers, and this would be a good help in these cases.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps it needs to be better, and it may still there's some developments and to be made here.
Yeah, I'd agree with that assessment. There's no technology barrier to it, particularly if it's using an over-the-top type application. But you really have to make sure that the translation is something that the call taker can really deal with, in terms of making sure they understand the requirements, and then also any information is provided and translated back into the original language that's understandable as well.
Yeah, thank you. And we had another question from Jar Mure from the Norwegian police, which is how do you define real-time text? Is it speech-to-text services or is it real-time chat?
So it's a real-time chat. So the difference with the chat is that each letter appears immediately in the interface of the receiver. So it's not like I don't know, a normal chat that you write a whole sentence and then push send. But each letter that you are writing when using RTT is shown in the screen of the receiver.
Thank you, Christina. Then we have a question from Irache Gomez Susaita from Atos. So new regulations on artificial intelligence usage are also here, and artificial intelligence is becoming a reality in the public safety domain. Should we also start discussing about AI in the framework of NG112?
Yes, we can start discussions on it. So I think we need here a step-by-step approach. We have seen that still there's a lack of knowledge on next generation 112. If we add artificial intelligence on the top of this, it may be a little bit too much, but of course we can start discussing it.
Yeah, and it's something that will be interesting to follow, because as we've been saying, the world of well, technology in general is changing, and AI will really bring many opportunities in the years to come. So it will be important to follow what is happening actually on that sector and analyze how we can integrate that in the strategy on NG112, because that can really bring some opportunities to improve public safety. So. But as Christina said, perhaps after we've started the education and sharing the basic knowledge on NG112, then we can further talk about like integration of new technologies. And one question from Sven Brun from the Health Directorate in Norway: will there be a list of approved providers of the important ESINet infrastructure?
I don't think there will be a list, but there's already a program, a conformance program. There's the conformance test. There's also the interoperability test done and organized by ETSI. I don't think there will be a list, but all the people or the organizations purchasing components can ask for the conformancy to the NG112 standards to the vendors.
Thank you, Christina. That's very clear. And finally, the last one. So not the last one anymore. This is not a question, but more it was a comment from Björn Skoglund from SOS Alarm in Sweden when we had that discussion about the risks and the limitations for like what will limit the implementation of NG112. Björn said that the risk of NG112 systems function doesn't work between countries, and that vendors or MNOs develop equipment and functions on their own without any thoughts on standardization. So that's basically a risk, and something we highlighted also in the list of requirements by stakeholders is to make sure that all the vendors and the MNOs develop products or offerings that are compatible with NG112. Christina, do you want to give a thought on that?
Well, this is specifically the risk that we want to avoid by highlighting the NG112 architecture, doing all the standards. We have done the standards also with together worldwide. We see that we have seen in our last black test event the compatibility between the US vendors and the European technologies. So this is exactly what we want to avoid. So let's hope that this doesn't occur.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say that, you know, we've seen RFPs in the last few years. I mean, from France, from North Macedonia, from Romania, demanding in the RFP that certain components or the entire solution conforms with NG112 standards. And really that's what you want to see. So that I suppose the advice here is to those that are going to be funding these projects and issuing RFPs to make sure that whatever solutions they're considering, it should be a requirement that they comply with NG112. Because what we don't want in the future, and this is when we talk about NG112 by design, that every cent invested from this day forward in anything, whether it's for AML or for an app or for a location server, that you demand NG112 compliance to reduce the risk of that becoming a stranded investment in the future.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just take the very last question, which is how we're going to solve the roaming access. It's from Christina Calvo from Everywhere.
So here the point is that with SIP communications, the video calls or the real-time text or the voice call will already be routed the same way. So the same issues will be solved in roaming for all the media. Okay,
thank you, Christina. So that brings us to the end of that event. We're still 84 people in this call. So thanks a lot for your attention and your participation during all these 3 days. We've been regularly over 100, 150 participants, which proves one thing is that NG112 is not boring. And there's a lot that we can take from all these presentations. And we'll surely follow up on that in our next activity. So you'll hear more from us in the weeks to come. As a follow-up, you'll also receive an email on Monday with the presentations and the recording of the event. If you still have some doubts or we're not able to follow everything, no worries. Everything will be in your mailbox in a few days. And we remain also at your disposal. If you have any question, you can just contact us. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be here during these 3 days. Thanks a lot to our speakers, to our colleagues also at EENA, arranging the communications and the logistics and the moderation during all these days. You've seen only 3 of us, but it's a full team that has been working on this event. So thanks a lot to the colleagues, and see you soon.